Some people who follow my work tell me that I deliver truths wrapped up in nice, comfy blankets. I take that as a compliment, and I'm going to get real for a second. There is such a thing as getting too comfortable. Healing rarely comes without difficulty. It's painful at times and terrifying too. It means letting go of narratives that hold you back and harm you. It means letting a part of yourself die so that another part of you can be reborn. Not everyone wants to get better, and that's okay. Some people have an identity tied to sickness. Others fear true wellness because it is the unknown, and the unknown is unpredictable. There is comfort in knowing exactly what your life will look like, even if that reality is making you sick. Our minds are familiarity-seeking machines. The familiar feels safe. That is, until we teach ourselves that discomfort is temporary and a necessary part of transformation.
So that's another thing too that I wanted to emphasize, is that I've noticed that as we're pursuing real estate, right? And like we're doing things we're not accustomed to, like calling sellers. Like, unless you have a sales background, that's not something that is necessarily easy for a lot of us, right? Or doing cold calls, door knocking, or whatever it may be. I think that I wanted to kind of emphasize the negative thought patterns, letting go of the old narratives that hold us back, right? I think something that my therapist said to me, in order for me to understand the negative narratives and the narratives that were holding me back, I needed to actually just even be aware of them. And a lot of times when I ask people like, well, where do you think that comes from? Or what my therapist said, I actually shared this in a mindset Zoom like a long time ago with Creighton, but something really powerful and yet gentle that my therapist said to me was, he gave me homework, and the homework was just notice. As you move throughout the day, as you're doing the work, as you're working hard towards your goals, and you end up hitting a wall, hitting a barrier, and you're not sure, it's like, just notice how you're feeling, what you're thinking, right? And just start there, because if introspection is not something that you're accustomed to, it could feel very weird. And again, you might hear a lot of people that are like, I don't really care about my feelings. I'm like, okay, like I can't force people to accept that, but I can paint them a picture if they're hitting certain patterns and they have certain narratives that are keeping them there. I'm like, well, I think maybe it's time to explore what's going on underneath. And what's interesting when you mention shame too, that totally comes from an environment that you're in. Like I grew up in a very, very shaming and blaming environment. I love my parents deeply, but our parents also came from, their own parents' limitations and, cultural family limitations, right? And patterns. So yeah, I love that you mentioned shaming, because the other thing that I've recognized too is that when I talk to people and I ask them like, oh, do you ever kind of share with your friends about certain things or like your struggles? And I hear a lot of people say like, oh, I don't really want to bother my friends with those things. And the beauty behind therapy and like the mindset that I've always had when I've gone to therapy is I never feel guilty that I get to talk and process more, because I'm paying that person to listen to me. And so, because on a more normal day-to-day basis, if I'm talking to my friends and I feel like I'm talking about myself a little bit too much, I feel guilty. With therapy, I'm like, nope, I never struggle with feeling guilty about talking about my stuff, because that's what I'm there for. So, yep. And the other part too, she talks about it in the book, where she actually talks about this therapy modality called interpersonal therapy, relationship between the therapist and the patient or client, if you will, like by creating a healthy bond where, we as the patient or client can talk to our therapist, and our therapist actually validates our feelings. Like for the first time, maybe in a really long time or ever, like to have your feelings and your thoughts and your perspectives validated for the first time is incredibly healing for people too. Everyone ask yourself this and really think about it. When you experience stuff as a kid, were you ever told you're fine? Like all of that stuff. I grew up with my father telling me I'm too sensitive. So I tried to actually not be sensitive. Oh my God. I like ugly cried more than anything, because I was like trying to fight that that, you know, internal, external thing. So man, I can't stop talking about and being a proponent of therapy because it's just incredibly healing. But yeah, just to have a safe space. And in that process of like interpersonal therapy where you're creating a healthy bond with your therapist, that actually allows people and allows you to be able to trust others more, because you're like, hey, I'm experiencing this with a therapist. The world maybe is not as scary. So for me, I'm highly, highly attracted to people that are able to validate their own feelings, right? And I'm like, because I know that when I share something with them, they could hold that. A lot of people can't hold pain. Like, I don't know, Annie, like for you, I mean, you had mentioned about, you know, like how you don't feel like you've had really any deep trauma and stuff like that. But like, have you ever tried to like share with your friends and they're like, and it was almost kind of like crickety, like crickets, not really having a dialogue, or I don't know. If someone were to share something with you, one issue that she notices in society is that, like, if someone says like, oh gosh, like I'm just feeling really down right now, or like, oh, someone died, or I'm just feeling really depressed, like sometimes depending on the familiarity of even just hearing those things, we don't actually press to ask them like, hey, how are you doing with all of that? Right. And it's like a lot of people will say like, I don't even know how to engage in a conversation like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm not saying that everyone needs to be a therapist, but what I'm saying is, like, what we're missing in that dialogue of someone sharing something really painful and the other person listening is amazing, right? But it's like, are we listening in a way where we're allowing that person to feel safe and not judged and feel awkward, and to share compassion and empathy? And that's another thing too, that like when I was doing the daily dial, I was partnering up with to do, I was actually giving feedback on rapport building for making seller calls. And the thing, you know, when we talk about the Sandler submarine and how the rapport is like one of the most important parts, like when you talk to a seller and you're like, hey, how are you doing today, you know, sir or ma'am? And they're like, I'm okay. Like, and a lot of people are like, oh, they just skip over that. I guarantee you that if you dare greatly to just lean a little bit into that, like what I always say is, oh, how come you're only doing okay and not great or not amazing? They assume like, oh, people don't want to hear my stuff.
Yeah.
They don't care.
Yeah.
And guess what? If you're trying to call and help people with their problems and solve problems, guess how different you will be compared to all the other wholesalers that are trying to supposedly help them. And so that would be something, just like a little tip for those of you that are direct to seller callers, is lean a little bit into that when you're asking how they're doing. Because that's going to be what, if they have something going on where they're just like, I'm okay, and you miss out on that, or if you actually tap into that, guess what? You're going to be able to figure out and understand their pain and motivation a lot faster than you kind of asking these like black and white questions, right? It's like just noticing these little nuances. Guess what's going to happen to you once you start going to therapy and working on yourself, like whether it's therapy and then like later on coaching or whatever, right? You're going to speed up your process, because you just said earlier, you're like, well, I just figured out I could just do it on my own. That's everyone. I'm going to buy the books. I'm going to go to YouTube channels. I'm going to listen to podcasts that talk about this. But the beauty behind therapy and even coaching is it's interactive. And the thing that you mentioned also of your upbringing, where you never felt like you could talk to your parents, right? Yeah. So I want to try to like kind of highlight a little bit of kind of the limitation that you were noticing yourself, but then also kind of this like new door that you're willing to explore. I hear that all the time. I'm going to do it on my own. I don't really need therapy. And again, I'm not trying to say this to judge people, because I know that it's scary to go to therapy and to like step into a new realm where you're like talking to a therapist about some really deep stuff and you're not sure how they can handle it, whether or not they could help, right? You could only go so far, because if you never grew up in a family where you could share your feelings about something and then have it be validated, that's really essentially attachment. And I did a Zoom on attachment that you can go back into the Zoom vault, the Kajabi vault. But to be able to be in a home as a child where you can share about your feelings, and then your parents or your caregivers validate that, right? Then you develop a language of like, oh, what I think and feel, especially feel, it's okay to feel that. Like my joke that I say to people is, so the current kind of stigma behind mental health and therapy is like, oh, you're crazy for going to therapy. My joking stigma that I want to turn around is, you've never been to therapy. What's wrong with you? Right. I'm like, but I won't I'm going to be gentle about that. But I'm such a huge proponent of like just even kind of like older mentor figures too. There's a lot of young men in our program. It's like, yes, hang out with each other, but hang out with these gentlemen that have been through life and can share stories, but also validate what you've been through. Like, it's just incredibly healing. Like, ever since I was younger, I've always sought older mentors to just talk to. So, and just learn life from. So Rick and John, thank you for sharing.
You will know when you're ready to begin this journey. Then you'll second guess yourself and want to quit. This is when it's the most important to stay committed and keep repeating the practice until it becomes a discipline. Eventually, that discipline becomes confidence, and confidence becomes change, and change becomes transformation. The real work has nothing to do with anything out there. It has everything to do with what's in you. It comes from you.
I just wanted to highlight that too, especially because Rick was saying earlier that, especially in the beginning, that first step is not easy. And like, she literally talks about it where she's like, yeah, like you're going to second guess yourself. You're not, the thing that I always experienced, and this is like, this is such a kind of spiritual acknowledgement too, is that when you're going to want to do this good work, I myself am Christian. I'm not trying to do anything weird, but I myself have recognized that anytime I want to do this good work of like going to Bible study or going to church or even going to a therapist and working on myself and growing, there's always going to be adversity. That's really the spiritual fight that we have to experience. And so when you second guess yourself and when you're not going to want to go, guess what? That's normal, because I really firmly believe that there's adversity in the spiritual realms where it's preventing us from wanting to grow and to be healed and to be whole, right? And so it's like I guarantee every time that I was about to have an appointment for therapy or wanted to go to church or, whatever, it's like, it was always like, I didn't feel like going. And, and then I recognized and I told myself, no, I have to go. So stay committed. And again, it's like what this quote says, where it's like, keep repeating the practice. When you talk about making seller calls and like how Caroline Kane always says like 1% better every day, she's trying to help us to understand that doing this thing, when you're calling and talking to a seller, you're developing a new language. You're developing a discipline. You're developing a flow. Like when you look at Pace's seller calls, he doesn't have commission sales breath. He's just trying to connect with the person. And guess what? The deeper that you connect internally with yourself, you're going to be able to connect with people a lot better as well. You're going to have that compassion and empathy. If anything, if you want an external motivation, if you want to make more money, do this for yourself.
The first step, a surprisingly challenging one, is to begin to imagine a future that looks different from the present. Close your eyes. Once you are able to envision a reality alternate to the one you're living, you're ready to move forward. And if you can't yet envision that reality, you're far from alone. There's a reason for this mental block. Stick with me. This book is written for you, as I was that person.
And so my request is this is your homework. Everyone who's here and listening, and or even if you're going to replay it later on, try to envision and imagine your life looking a little bit different. Even part of it too is like noticing where you sometimes feel stuck, and then ask yourself, what would it look like if I didn't kind of hit this wall and hit this struggle every time? What would it look like to not have this particular negative thought pattern, right? I think even just starting there. And I would venture to guess that especially for those that are even newer to real estate and entrepreneurship, spend time noticing how you react and feel about certain things when things don't go your way, because I guarantee that all of us experience that probably on a daily basis with this journey of entrepreneurship. So the first step, begin to imagine a future that looks different from the present, an alternate, a reality that's alternate to the one that you're living in. I think that's kind of a little bit of even just exploring your why, is to try to imagine you're not burdened and you don't feel these weights and these boulders on you. Just try to imagine that.